Let's yap about domain expansions. I've recently gotten a number of questions on this subject, so let's get into it. Also, for my anime onlys, the nature of some of these questions are very spoilery, so we'll see you in the next one. All right, so first up, we've got a few questions from CLP revolving around kenjaku and domain expansions. The first is, could kenjaku use the domain expansion of an absorbed cursed spirit? So there's going to be a lot of nuance to this answer. And in general, I would say no to the question you're asking. Kenjaku can't just say, domain expansion and use the smallpox cursed spirits domain. But like we saw, he could just summon the smallpox cursed spirit and it can use the domain. So essentially, he still has access to using those domains. He's just not doing it himself, if that makes sense. But what I will say, the interesting nuance here is that we know he can extract curse techniques from cursed spirits by using maximum uzumaki, just like he did with Mahito, and then we saw him use idol transfiguration. An interesting thing to consider is, could he, after have uzumakiing Mahito, instead of using idol transfiguration, could Kenjaku have cast a domain expansion and imbued idol transfiguration into his own domain, maybe as like a one-time use? I would say that's theoretically possible, but I still would be kind of iffy on it. Now, CLP's next question is it possible to use another body's domain expansion? For example, Kenjaku, could he still use Kaori's domain expansion even though he's not in her body anymore? Or could he use Geto's domain expansion since he's in Geto's body, but he is not Geto, right? So I've addressed this question briefly in other videos because iterations of this get asked a lot. For example, could Sukuna use Megumi's domain expansion? So the way I feel about this is yes and no. So I think if you're a sorcerer that has access to multiple curse techniques, like a Sukuna, like a Kenjaku, like an Akotsu, you can use other techniques in your domain expansion, but it's still your domain expansion. So, for example, the domain we saw Kenjaku use, the barrierless one with the big, grotesque thing in the middle, I think that is his domain no matter what technique he's using. But he could imbue other techniques into that one. So it's always going to look like that because your domain is a manifestation of your innate domain, which is kind of like your soul. And I'll talk more about that in a later question in this video. But so Okotsu's domain is a great example, right? We know that he imbued Angel's curse technique into his, and he could seemingly swap out any technique that he has copied into his domain. But his domain will always be true love potential or whatever it was called with all of the swords and stuff. So I think, yes, in a way, you can use other curse technique domains, but it's always going to be your domain. And this slides nicely into your third question of, do I think it's possible Kenjaku was using Geto's domain against Yuki? So again, I still think he was using his domain, but he might have imbued it with Geto's technique. That was just such a quick moment. We basically see him open the domain and then Yuki is like crumbled on the ground. I can't remember what video I spoke about this on recently, but I even suggested maybe it was Kaori's technique. Like maybe the sure hit effect was the gravity just like crumbling her body in that moment. But who knows? Next up, we got this question from Daruno, who asks if barrierless domains could be the result of channeling positive cursed energy into the creation of the domain as opposed to regular cursed energy. And my gut instinct on this would be that that's probably not what's going on, just because of like how next level barrierless domains are. They've been described as divine. And I feel like if it was simply channeling positive cursed energy, which is very difficult to do. Most people can't perform reverse curse technique. But still, I feel like if that was the case, then other characters would have like brought that up, especially Gojo. Now, maybe he just didn't really have the opportunity to talk about that type of thing during the fight, but I feel like, maybe Kusakabe watching it or Tengen would have mentioned it back when Kenjaku did it, that they would have said like, oh, this domain is the result of positive cursed energy. I feel like that just would have been something that people gleaned and would have mentioned. Now, it's entirely possible that my interpretation there is wrong, and maybe that is how you do it. But my best guess would be more akin to what you say down here. In order to create a barrierless domain, you have to have some sort of central structure that kind of serves as the foundation of the binding vow that has allowed you to have a barrierless domain, right? So I do think ultimately it's some like complicated nexus point of jujutsu like refinement and binding vows that enable the barrierless domains, but at this point we really don't know. Maybe we'll find out. Finally, today we got two questions from On Mayoto, and I'm going to start with this second one because it's more in line with what we've been talking about. And he wants to know, what makes an innate domain? Are they permanent? Can they change? Are they just as random as curse techniques? So the way these things are described is they are basically kind of like your soul. They're not literally your soul, because your soul is something else entirely in Jujutsu Kaisen, but your innate domain is basically like the essence of you, and you are born with one, like you say. And not just sorcerers have these. Literally everyone has an innate domain. Even if you're just a normal human, you're a cursed spirit, you're a sorcerer, you're a fox, you probably have an innate domain. So because of that, I think they are permanent. It is just like a representation of you, right? Now, I say permanent, that's not to say that, when you're a baby, it's going to look exactly the same as when you're 35, because I do think it's kind of like shaped by your character. So we could get into some like deterministic philosophy here, like, was Mahito always going to be evil, so even since he was a baby, his innate domain looked like it looks. Another subject for maybe another time. So I do think that maybe they could change aesthetically and kind of adapt to how you're adapting as a person, but I would say fundamentally they are the same, and they're not going to change because they're just you, in the same way you aren't going to change. But obviously, you're going to grow and you look a little bit different, and your personality will change. I think the innate domain would change maybe in those types of ways, but again, not fundamentally. Which again, to cite back to what we were talking about earlier, this is why I think even if you have access to other techniques, or even if you're in another body, your domain expansion is always still going to be the manifestation of your innate domain, your soul, if it were, right? So it'll still look like, Malevolent Shrine if you're Sukuna. It's not going to change to Megumi's, Shadow Void. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but he could still imbue the 10 shadows into Malevolent Shrine. And then for your first question here on, would Toji survive Sukuna's finger if he was at his lowest, similar what happened to Megumi? So there's kind of two ways to tackle this, and I again can't remember which video I briefly talked about this in. It was probably the Yuji Heavenly Restricted video. But could Toji survive eating Sukuna's finger like Yuji did? Let's talk about that first. I think maybe if Yuji's heavenly restriction is part of why if he does have a heavenly restriction, if that was part of why he could survive eating the finger, then it would stand to reason that Toji would similarly have a better chance of survival from eating it. But I think it may be more of Yuji was specifically engineered to withstand the finger via whatever experimentation Kenjaku did. So even if Yuji has a heavenly restriction, I'm not sure that's the reason he survived the finger. But if it is, then yeah, Toji would seemingly survive it as well. But I think probably most likely Toji would die from consuming the finger like 99% of people do, as we're told. Now, when it comes to Megumi, there's some potential nuance here, because is the finger Megumi ate, which was something that was created right there in the moment via binding vows, Sukuna remade himself a cursed object and fed it to Megumi, is that necessarily the same level of poisonous, if you will, than one of the 20 fingers that's existed for 1,000 years growing in strength? Maybe it is. Maybe they are completely equally poisonous and Megumi survived it. But it's at least possible that that was like less lethal, since it was, one of Yuji's fingers that Sukuna had just made, if you will. But that's really not even important. I think how Megumi survived it is, one, because of how strong Megumi is as a vessel, which would cite back to why Sukuna got so initially excited when he first fought Megumi back in the day, when Megumi was about to summon Maharaga. And I've talked about this in videos before, so if you want the more in-depth explanation, you can find those. But when Sukuna first got excited in that moment with Megumi, he didn't know what Maharaga could do. So his excitement was not at the potential of the adaptation, meaning his excitement had to have just been at the potential for Megumi to be his vessel, meaning like very strong jujutsu people can be his vessel potentially. So I think that's more in line with why Megumi was able to survive the finger, but also him being at his lowest more had to do with Megumi not being able to take control back from Sukuna in the same way that Yuji is a cage. He didn't want Megumi to be a cage. So to go back to the initial question, if we assume Toji could survive the finger, then yes, Sukuna would need Toji to be seemingly at his lowest so that Toji wouldn't become a cage for him, just like Yuji. And that's going to do it for this one, y'all. Thank you so much for the questions and for the support. And just as a note, I'm going camping this weekend, so I might not have service. So you might not see me for a couple days, but if I do have service, you will be seeing me.